Oh, hey, welcome to today's panel. A little bit of a touchy subject. How dark should your stories go? As a writer of dark fantasy myself, I know the darker side of human nature, and the mind is often a very common theme in my works. But sometimes I find myself questioning, oh, am I going too dark with this, or is this acceptable? So I've got some awesome authors here to talk about it with me. Let's pass it over to them. Raven.
Hi, I'm a Seattle local author of science fiction and fantasy, and my fantasy tends to be fairly dark. I didn't think my science fiction was, but everybody tells me I definitely tend to write things in the darker areas. And this one in particular, my epic fantasy, I know has been sometimes described as grimdark, even though I wouldn't agree with that, which is a topic we'll talk more about. So I definitely wanted to talk about this, and so here I am.
That's awesome. EM.
My name is Whitaker. I am the author of the urban fantasy series Turbulence, which I just got the other day. And I am looking forward to discussing more about the darker side of the panel.
That's awesome. Congratulations on getting that physical copy of Turbulence. It looks beautiful.
Thank you. It took forever.
Yeah. And Matt.
Hey, hi. I'm Matt Posner, author of the School of the Ages series. So I have my copy too. This is the new cover. School of the Ages series is it's about America's greatest magic school, and it has some dark moments and some very light moments too. So I believe in finding the right balance for readers, and that's what I'm going to talk about today.
That's awesome. Well, let's start it off with a simple question. What does it mean to write the darker? Like when you think, okay, I'm going to write a book that's a little bit darker, what do you automatically go to? What's dark to you? Anyone?
Well, I guess for me, I'm looking at something that isn't afraid to talk about the psyche, to really get into somebody's brain and look at why people do what they do. I think that's part of the reason that people do like Game of Thrones and some of the other series that can tread into the dark fantasy, grimdark area, is that it's not just that somebody killed somebody, it's why they did it. And the fact that we might find ourselves going, ooh, if I were in that scenario, I might actually feel like killing somebody too. The fact that we can identify with them is what, for me, makes it kind of dark and makes it tread that line, because we don't like to think about the fact that we're all just, one bad day away from being able to be capable of great, horrible things.
It's interesting, sort of those personality traits that we all try to hide or that we try to get over, writing characters with them. That's an interesting perspective. Matt, what about you? What does it mean to write dark to you?
I think it's showing negative aspects of human nature, showing people being cruel or bigoted. These are things I've dealt with a lot. Violence, and also psychological violence. And when we look at things like the characters who are admirable characters as opposed to the villains, like I have villains who are Nazis and murderers and all sorts of things like that. But if we want to see our main characters, the ones that are offered for the reader to identify with, doing things that maybe they regret, whatever it might happen to be. I'm not going to show my main characters doing awful things that make them unrelatable, but I have shown them getting revenge, killing people sort of mercilessly because they were just angry or whatever and regretting it later. So for me, darkness is both the villains being awful and also the main characters doing things that create the risk of them not being relatable.
Interesting. What about you, EM?
I think the darkness aspect is a little bit of the psychological, but it can also be like a situational kind of thing. Like, for example, when I was growing up, I lived in Baltimore City for a little bit of time. So you saw stuff like, prostitution, drugs, mugging, shootings, that sort of thing. Or talking about the taboo subjects. Like, I know a girl and I were talking on Facebook about how she read a book and they glorified sexual assault. Things that people do not go into, but like I was saying earlier, sometimes you can go too deep into that line. And when you go too deep into that line is where you're either going to make readers repulsed or you're going to want to issue a trigger warning. And when you have to do either one of those, you're kind of crossing it too far.
I have no idea whose music that is.
That's Matt. But it was
Sorry.
I liked it.
Yeah, if I could talk about sexual violence a little bit, since that came up there.
Yeah.
You know, there is a tendency now to use sexual assault, especially sexual assault on women, and this is in Hollywood, but it's also in fiction, as a means of character development, to show why women would be tough or strong, or to prove that they are powerful, or else. But it's sort of like a shortcut for some writers, and I really disagree with this strongly. I don't believe that rape and sexual violence should be used very often in fiction. I can't see situations in which they really add to the reader's pleasure, or situations in which they make a female character stronger. I don't believe that this type of fiction really depicts rape accurately or shows its effects, and I don't really want to see it in my entertainment. So although I'm more aware that my opinion is just an opinion, I feel very strongly about that. I just want to say, let's get rape out to a bare minimum and only done very tastefully and very smartly. Because it just doesn't, it's being used as a shortcut rather than being used sensibly a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's true. And it is a really fine line to walk, you know. I feel like some, like Matt was saying, a lot of writers do use it as a shortcut to sort of get their character where they need to go. But then on the flip side, sometimes it's, and it sounds terrible, but it's realistic. It is a realistic depiction, or sort of, it happens in the sort of situations. Like, let's say mine is a medieval era fantasy. In a medieval era fantasy, that sort of thing would happen all the time because of the way that women were sort of treated as objects or as possessions instead of, you know, equal with men. So definitely it's not something that you should just, oh, well, you know, I'm looking for a new plot twist, let's do this. But, you know, there are times when it is accurate, and I think that's part of what makes it dark fantasy, in my case dark fantasy or dark science fiction or dark paranormal or whatever, is that it really does touch on the darker side of human nature. You know, violence is so common in especially fantasy. You have the heroes getting, you know, fighting hundreds of people, and it's so normal. But then there's something about that sort of sexual abuse that is so much more personal, that it's definitely not a subject that you want to go haywire with, like, you know, violence. You can have I've got an assassin as a main character. That's like violence. It, you know, everything about him is violent, but then you've got to be careful doing that. But at the same,
he's violent, your main character, but he doesn't kill people who don't deserve it, though.
Well, yeah, he kind of does. And that's one of the things that is actually really fun about writing this character. I don't want to talk about my book too much, but it's fun because you can have, as long as in his mind, okay, this person needs to die or deserves to die, whether or not they do, he kills them. So like it's a very fine line to walk.
Well, it's complicated too. I mean, as a survivor of sexual assault myself, you know, I approach it from a perspective that not everybody gets to approach it from. And for me, reading something like that, when it's done well, it's something that I can identify with. And it is something that Andy was talking about. It's this personal level that it's realistic. It's something that does happen to characters. And to some extent, I feel like if you completely shy away from the things that make you uncomfortable, then you don't have a relatable character either. That sometimes you have to have realistic events, be it murder or rape or abuse or whatever, to create a world that people believe exists. And, you know, I think that's an area where also George R.R. Martin kind of gets away with some stuff that we wouldn't normally see as kosher, I guess, in that, you know, people have done this whole don't write about rape, don't have your characters raped as a plot device, and then he does it. And to some degree, because he's a man, he gets away with it.
There's ways to do it tastefully, too. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to go into pages and pages and pages of it, that's not going to keep anybody's interest. No. But you can have a couple of lines where somebody insinuates, somebody reacts. It could be 3-4 paragraphs and then you're done, but the point is made.
Well, and that's how it differs also in the books versus the TV series, is that he does it a lot more tastefully, in my opinion, than the TV show does. The TV show stretches it out for pages and pages, like you're saying, in such a way that is uncomfortable for a lot of audiences. Whereas in the book, it's like, okay, this is something that happens to her, and it's important to her character development, and we move past it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the truth is that like if you boil everything down, there's only 4 reasons to do anything. There's sex, money, and there's 2 other ones that I don't remember offhand. But basically everything comes down to 4, basic reasons behind human behavior. So all of the things that a character is going to do is going to boil down to these base instincts or these basic wants. So when you're creating a character, don't automatically go that route. Don't go any route automatically. Think about, okay, what would make this character realistic? For example, this story that I'm working on now about a female thief. She's surrounded by men. So there is that potential because she's smaller, weaker than everyone else around her. So it's very believable that something like that could happen to her. But then, did I want to go that route? It's something that I have to think about very carefully before crafting the story, because on the one hand, I risk alienating a staggering number of people if I do it wrong. And yet at the same time, if the character needs to, the story that needs to be told needs to go to certain places, is that what I want to do? Is there another one? So it's not about gratuitous violence, any of that kind of thing. It's not about gratuity. It's about doing what's right for the character and the story that you're trying to tell. Definitely not.
Exactly.
Another one that a lot of people really, really shy away from is cruelty to animals and children. Both of those are very, very sensitive subjects. And for example, in the 3rd book of this assassin story that I was writing, The Hunter, I actually asked a few people, okay, is it bad if he kills this horse here to unseat the writer, or would it make it be like it's just gratuitous? And they were like, oh, have him do it a different way. And so there's a lot of that people just instinctively say, oh no, that's you've gone too far with that. It's kind of interesting because you can kill men, no problem, thanks a lot. Violent, fighting women, as long as they're perceived as warriors, it's okay. But then there's still that instinct to, oh, it's a man fighting a woman, so he shouldn't kill her. Sexist. It can be sexist any way you do it. But then that very sensitive subject, animals and children.
Yeah, maybe don't kill women if the way that it's written is to encourage the men to enjoy watching women kill women. Yeah. That obviously is something we would all disagree is terrible. Absolutely. As far as killing horses in that particular example, this is something that would have happened as part of a military strategy, or certainly a strategy like your character was using. Cruelty to children that's indeed probably the riskiest of these issues to cover. Although there has been a lot of stuff about, maybe not in fantasy so much, but in crime fiction about that scenario. So we can take our cues from crime fiction and try to figure out what is and is not appropriate. I personally would not care to read it, except in something like, what happened to Bran in a Game of Thrones, for example. We understand that he pushed off the window, and that he overcomes this thing, and so it's very different from being encouraged to be entertained by it.
Yeah,
I think that's actually, sorry, Raven. I think that's the perspective of it, because if you're writing about a child who is overcoming this treatment, then people are like, okay, you've got it from the right perspective. Whereas if you're writing a character who inflicts the treatment, then people will say, oh, I can't stand that. So it's kind of it's all about perspective, or the perspective of the character.
I ran into the same thing you did, Andy, in that, in A Mask and Blood, she's an assassin, like your character, and I have a scene in there where a horse dies, and it's pivotal to the plot line, and it's used, very similar to what Matt was talking about from the military perspective of, if you have enemies, this is something that's going to be done. But when I gave a copy to my tax preparer, because she expects copies of books from all of her authors, she couldn't make it past that scene. So it completely stopped her from reading the rest of the book because of that scene, even though it's not horrifically gratuitous. And so, yeah, I think you run into, anytime you're dealing with animals and women and children, there is that risk of alienating some readers because that's a little too dark for them. I'm willing to take that risk if it motivates the plot, but I think it's a complication that all authors kind of have to deal with.
Yeah. Sort of approaching it with an understanding of what you're putting your character through if you go down that not just the physical, but the psychological and the mental,
yeah,
emotional, and how they recover, how they continue. Because I've read some, where these scenes happen, and then the next scene or the next book, the character is just like normal, and there's that.
Yeah, that doesn't work that way.
Exactly.
Well, just throw it out here: death of children in popular fantasy, Hunger Games.
Yeah,
Children killing each other.
Yeah.
That give it, and no one has really objected to that very strenuously. Is that an indication of something that's okay, and if so, why?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, it's so complex, because what makes one thing okay in one book and not okay in another, in the end, I think it comes down to the portrayal. Because if it was super gratuitous, like in the Hunger Games, if I remember correctly, the books are very non-descriptive about most of the deaths. And the deaths, not of the main antagonist, but a lot of the deaths take place off scene. You have the cannon shooting the numbers into the sky, and you see that these characters died, but it doesn't actually show it. There are a few that they show, but for the most part, they take off camera.
Yeah. Other than the Rue, I think they go really fast too, if it's on camera.
I think Battle Royale was before the Hunger Games, and I liked that one a lot better because it did go into dark, it did go into gritty. You saw everything, and every person had a purpose, had a story, no matter how small. And then you saw the decision they made. Either they played the game or they didn't play.
Yeah.
And it was a lot better than Hunger Games. I tried reading Hunger Games, and I couldn't get past the beginning of book 2.
There's another upvote for Battle Royale. I love that movie.
Yeah. The book is good, too, if you can find it translated.
So is the manga. I've got both of them.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so then I guess let's talk a little bit about the darker things that are acceptable and not. There's a lot of gray areas, but then there are some that, go-to. Violence is always a go-to, whether it's crime, whether it's fantasy, science fiction, there's always that element of violence. I think death is another common theme in dark fantasy, whether it's the death of a loved one or the death of the king, or, there's always death. What else is there?
I think emotional scarring. And it takes a lot to write about those sort of things, but it depends on the severity of it. Like, you don't want your character to be so depressed all the time that you don't think that character is going to move forward. And so that's going to lose the reader's interest.
But there do need to be emotional scars for it to be realistic also, but then also interesting.
And relatable.
Yeah, and for character growth as well. Because they can't grow if they're always whining about it and not doing anything.
I often write that when talking about how to write well, I would say that character needs to be somebody that you're okay to read about. If you're traveling with, let's say you're with that person, not necessarily like you. We don't need our characters to be Mary Sue's, but we need characters that we're okay with. And so, with the case you were talking about, EM, for somebody who's upset constantly all the time, maybe we don't want to read about as much. We want to get over it and get on to taking action, possessing some agency in the story. So that might be why some people don't like it, rather than the actual fact of the emotional scarring.
Oh, I totally understand that. I mean, there was one book where the main character went through a whole bunch of different trials, and then when she got into power, she had the same thing happen to this one person that happened to her, and it was some sort of sexual assault. And I literally threw the book at the wall. I could not read it after that.
You mean because after you know what it's like, how could you do it to somebody else?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting theme, though. And it's not one that it's explored often in that arena, but it's definitely something that, I mean, from the aspect of the perspective of bullying, you know, bullies, people who are bullied often go on to bully others. People who are the victims of violence often go on to victimize others, you know, violently. And so it's definitely not something that I'm promoting, but it's an interesting thing to explore, especially in the context of dark fiction, fantasy, whatever. You know, you've got someone who is as much a victim as the people they're victimizing. I know this is something that I think about in fantasy a lot, because, you know, in modern, let's say, science fiction, paranormal, urban fantasy, you've got the modern element of psychologists and psychiatrists to sort of help you deal with it. Whereas in a medieval world, there was no psychology, or, you know, psychology wasn't a common practice. So you don't have anybody to help a child understand why they were bullied, or why bullying someone else is bad, or, you know, no parenting books to help you stop being a drunk parent who beats your child or whatever. And so it's interesting to write antagonists, or to conceive of antagonists that are as much victims as the people they are victimizing.
There's a great example of that. Anne Bishop writes a lot of dark fantasy, and her Black Jewels trilogy, especially in the first three, before she expanded it to a series, there are protagonists that were abused and bullied, and part of the system of power that's in play has created this kind of dynamic. And you see them go through a lot of horrific different things in fairly dark areas, and yet still be relatable. But again, they don't have the psychologists and the therapy and the various things we have in our world to help them understand that. So it's more of their growth is more about, I guess, other people being mirrors of them and helping them understand, to see what's going on in themselves and in others in such a way that they have this really neat arc. And so even though her series is really dark, I mean, it deals with male castration and all kinds of, you know, pretty dark areas, it's a really great story, because you see that progression that would have to happen when you don't have the support systems that we do.
Interesting. I'm definitely going to have to look her up now.
I think mental illness is one other thing that, you know, can be defined as a gray area, but people are scared to go into. And I see that sometimes in Facebook posts, you know, when I think you had a couple of posts where you were asking about different mental illnesses and somebody got offended. But mental illness is out there, you know. It's a subject that it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And it makes people realistic. I mean,
we need representation in that, you know. It's the same thing when we're talking about needing representation of people of color or other diversity, you know, we also need to see it with mental illness, because you're right, it's out there and characters do have it. Jennifer Brozek has a series, Never Let Me, that the main character is schizophrenic. And so she addresses some of that lack of representation in that. It's another good one out there that kind of covers what you're talking about.
Because I see these articles out there, and then I see it in, you know, other places where people want it represented, but there's that stigmata.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a stigma where people say, you know, you're taking it too far, or you're not doing it justice. And actually, I've really enjoyed researching mental illnesses to use them. I know it sounds so grim to say that I've enjoyed it, but, you know, it's such a fascinating topic to understand how the human brain is basically our own worst enemy in many situations. I mean, the hunter, the character, he has a very classic form of dissociative identity disorder. It's a main character with a mental illness, and every single one of the books, there's different mental illnesses and emotional disorders and things like that. And on the face of it, it's a really interesting story. But then as you get into it, or as I research more about these disorders, it helps me to write a character who's more well-rounded. And actually, in researching dissociative identity disorder, it gave me the way to close the series, close the circle at the end. That, it's not, he's not going to stop being he's not going to be any less of a killer, but he will have found a measure of peace with what's going on in his mind. And because of the research that I've done into dissociative identity disorder, I can sort of put that all together. And like, it really does make for a much better character than just someone who's a great killer.
Yeah.
I wish I had the book in front of me, but there was one I used. I use it while writing. It's called, I think it's The Guide to Character Sketching or something like that. It was written by a PhD professor. And it has almost every single trait you could think of, every type of personality, type of person, jobs. It's like a 400-page book, and she made a second edition.
Wow, that would be really something to hands on.
Maybe we could get that later and have a link to it.
Have a link to it, yeah.
Yeah. That sounds like something that people viewing this video would like. Andy, can I raise an issue I think that we'd all enjoy talking about?
Please.
The killing of characters that are sort of like faceless characters, like stormtroopers or police who don't have personalities, as something like to demonstrate how tough somebody is. Maybe it's more of a Hollywood thing than a novelistic thing. But I really sort of feel like if people are going to be killed, there should be some impact from it. Like, we should know who they are. I don't like the idea of just faceless people being killed because they're part of the story arc of somebody else.
Well, if it's a random stormtrooper who dies, how am I as the reader going to have any attachment to that? Well, how is that death going to have any meaning?
Well, it doesn't for a stormtrooper.
I don't know the person. Yeah.
It doesn't for a stormtrooper, obviously, or a droid, but I'm just leaving out those kinds of contexts. For cops, for example, maybe. You see, I'm saying people are people. So the point, I don't know if I'm making the point exactly, but leaving out stormtroopers, after a certain point, I get to where I'm a little weary of seeing people just get mowed through as if they don't matter.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of writers. I mean, I've used that. I'm going to say the disposing of the red shirts of the stormtroopers, not necessarily as a means of showing the badassery of the character, but then let's say the hunter is breaking into a mansion and he finds himself face to face with the palace guards. If he decides, if he's going to chop his way through them because he has no other way to get out, you can't give each of the guards a personality for when they're coming in, just for the sake of being an obstacle, a very realistic obstacle. The hunter goes and he kills the king. The guards are going to react. They're going to try to kill him. So he has to respond to the threat. And maybe he tries to get away, but then he can't get away, so he has to kill them. There is a time and a place for the deaths of these faceless characters, whether it's military fiction or the more violent. But then I totally agree with what you're saying. Don't just have your character kill people to prove that he's a badass, especially if you're trying to show the depth in the character. Make these deaths. Don't make him or her kill him and just say, oh, it's done. Have him think, have her pause, make the deaths mean something to the story overall, even if you never learn the name of the faceless guard he just killed. They have to have
he could have a death agony on his face, or he could be slightly heavier than the other one and have darker hair and make a noise or something, just so that he's clearly a person.
Yeah.
One thing I really can't stand is shock value deaths. They're just there for, oh, okay, I got bored with this character. I actually had to go back and redraft my second book because I had a guy, the first thing that I saw with this guy was his death, because he's supposed to not live through. But I didn't have a backstory. I didn't know who this person was. And while I was drafting the first draft of my second book, I had to go back and redo my first book for that reason. So it was one major reason it took so long. But when you're creating a story for somebody and then you realize that this person that you're going to end up letting go has impact on either one or more characters, that's not going to be a shock value death anymore, especially if you lead up to it. If you have, like, you know, a prelude up to it, you know?
For sure.
And a lot of authors don't do that. They just, oh, well, I made too many characters. I'm just going to kill this one off. Nobody's going to miss him.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For example, in Blade of the Destroyer, the Hunter's book, I knew going in that this little girl that's introduced in the beginning of the book, she was going to die because it was what was needed to set the Hunter off down his quest to revenge and all of the whole story. But then as I was writing her, I realized there had to be an impact before she died. So by just the simple act of saving her, it sort of broke his character. Because, you know, as an assassin who's used to killing people, all of a sudden he decides to save the life of a little girl. It sort of shows that bit of humanity. And then, of course, there is more backstory to it and it's fleshed out. But there was a reason for her existence before the antagonist killed her off. So that's I think sort of what EM's trying to say is, you know, even if you are going to kill the characters eventually, give them meaning all the way up until their death, instead of just the value of their death to the character that you're
Yeah, and you might end up making people upset with it, but if it's meant to be part of the story, so be it. People grow in different ways, and when you lose someone close, that can be a prelude to character growth. Not just, oh, I'm going to kill him just because I'm bored.
Doing something because you're bored is never a good idea as a writer.
No, the reason I did what I did with this particular person is because of the actions he did in his past led up to the actions now. It was either do this or do that. Either way, the guy was going to die, but it was just the way he was going to go out and how long.
Yeah.
There's just a difference between fiction and reality, because in reality, deaths are sometimes random, but in fiction, the death of somebody who isn't a red shirt or a stormtrooper should feel meaningful. And we can look at some instances from, for say, The Walking Dead, where maybe some audience members have not felt the deaths were as meaningful as they needed to be. Especially the death, what's the name of the character who was killed in the hospital? Beth, right?
Yeah.
I remember being really annoyed when she was killed off because they'd spent a whole time with a character arc to develop her and make her into a more grown-up person who would be ready to contribute to the series, and then they killed her in a random incident. So there are times where there are some misfires that I don't know whether people would classify that particular one, EM, you could say, as a shock death or not. But I thought it was a mistake. So it is better if any time that a character dies, it does feel like the culmination of something that was going on with that character within the story.
Yeah, make each death count, in essence. All right, we're down to our last couple of minutes. You guys have anything else you want to discuss along the lines of darkness?
Maybe that just darkness serves as much a purpose as light, in that you can't recognize light without dark.
That's very true.
So I think it's important to explore all of humanity and not just half of it.
I actually really enjoyed that essence, that aspect of dark fantasy. Writing a half demon assassin, it's going to be dark. So then when the character goes against his nature, even in some small way, and takes some small action, whether it's to protect someone or to help someone or to do something that, you know, that's a little bit of light, because of the abundance of darkness, that little bit of light stands out so much more. And I think that's one reason that dark fantasy is I mean, it's my favorite genre, because you don't have to have these, you know, big heroic characters. You just need to have humans or human characters with just that little bit of decency, and they take that one action, or they do make that one decision, and that right there brings out the hero within them, even if it's just for 10 seconds, even if it's the last thing they do after a life of being a total douchebag. They sacrifice themselves to save someone. You know, that right there, there's that sense of redemption, or there's that sense of heroism that in, say, in the more epic forms of fantasy, you don't get that.
It's Sidney Carton from Tale of Two Cities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right.
I think everybody has demons in their closet. So it's not bad to write about those demons as long as those demons are resolved by the end of, say, a book or a series. It's not just left on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
That's very true. Or instead of having them resolved, leaving hope for the future, that there will be some sort of resolution. For example, I just wrote a short story about a ex-soldier, fantasy, with PTSD. And he doesn't get over his PTSD completely. It doesn't show that life is better for him by the end of the story. It's a short story. But there is that glimmer of hope. After all of the darkness of the story, there's that one moment of light that shows hope for the future. And I think there's that bittersweet feel to it that is so common in dark fantasy or dark fiction. It's very bittersweet, you know. Nothing good came out of the story, or, you know, the good. But there's an element of hopefulness that things will get better. And that, I mean, for me as a reader, that's what I like to see is, you know, don't fix all the problems in the world. Don't make everything right, but give me a sense of hope for the future, and I'm good.
To give you a character arc where something is different at the end than it started off. It doesn't have to be from going to 100% better, but there should be at least something where we feel like there's a transformation is taking place. A story happened because it has an end, and the end is not the same as the beginning. It's not a reinforcement of, well, everything sucks. Well, wait a minute, no, everything sucks. That's not a story.
And on the adverse, and not everything is rainbows and unicorns, you know? That's not a story either. You got to have both.
Sure.
All right. Well, that is our time. Thank you guys so much for joining in the discussion. If you want to find out more about Raven, EM, and Matt, check out the comments below, and you can find out about their awesome writing. Have a great day.